Hello and welcome back to another episode of Adventist Eh. I'm your host, Kevin. Today I'm joined by Pastor David Hayward. He is a pastor over in Eastern Canada, been pastoring for about 30 years. But I'm curious to hear more about his journey because he is also known as the Naked Pastor, which is a very interesting title to hold. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. Nice to be on your show, and hi to everybody who's listening. Yeah,
So probably a great place to start is,
yeah,
why are you a naked pastor?
yeah. Let's address the elephant in the room, right? Get that out of the way. Yeah, I started the Naked Pastor blog way back in about, I think it was 2005, and I was a pastor of a local church at that time. And then I decided I wanted my blog to be unique and different, and so I decided I was going to be completely honest and open and vulnerable and transparent about what really goes on in the life of a pastor and in the life of a church. So that's why I called it Naked Pastor. It's just me being totally upfront and not hiding anything. So I know the name. It's sounds weird. It raises eyebrows, but you don't forget it either. So it's kind of stuck, and it's become quite a big thing now. So uh, yeah. So the Naked Pastor is just me speaking my truth as um, transparently as possible. Yeah.
And that's one of the things I was looking forward to hearing more is your story, 30 years of pastoring, a lot. That's a lot of time, a lot of
Yep.
interactions, a lot of thoughts. You also have your master's degree, so you put time into this.
Mhm.
So what was it like kind of the lead up to this idea? Like what sparked the need to be honest and to be open? Like where did that kind of like light bulb moment come that this is something I should pursue?
It's always been a driving factor for me in my life. I remember even at a very young age feeling quite determined to be myself. I wrestled a lot with being open and honest about what I thought, what I felt, growing up in a very religious home. And, I felt that it was that I should be able to be who I was. And, when you grow up in a very religious kind of family culture, church, all that, that isn't always welcomed. It's not always a rewarded thing. And so I ended up feeling quite a lot that I was hiding myself. And so this was a very gradual thing where I just gradually got to the point where I felt I could be as honest as I could and be as much my authentic self as I could, and I left the ministry, the official ministry in 2010. That was 14 years ago. It's hard to believe it was that long ago, but I'd already served the church as a local pastor for 30 years. And, but the reason I had to leave the ministry at that time was because I felt I couldn't continue on my own personal journey within the confines of that system. So I left the ministry and continued doing my work that I'd already been doing for about 5 years online with Naked Pastor. I decided to put, all my efforts into that to make it a full-time thing. And so that's what I've been doing ever since.
Then what brought you into the ministry at first? Because somebody, I mean, from my experience, is somebody that's trying to claim and honor who themselves are, doesn't seem like that's the kind of person that steps into being a pastor within the structures of a church system. So what brought you into ministry?
Yeah, it's that's an interesting question. I mean, there's a big part of me that's kind of naive, and I just assume that, of course, people want me to be myself, and because that's what I want from others. But when you enter into a system that is kind of famous for not encouraging, very authentic kind of self-expression, at least in my experience. But I just sort of naively found myself in a master's program, studying Bible theology, um, doing another diploma to get a master's of divinity, continuing on my studies. I started a PhD program in New Testament studies. It was very serious. And then ended up getting ordained and serving churches. And I always seemed to gravitate towards churches that I felt were spacious and I was free to be myself, and where I felt I could encourage others to be free. And it was, I as is usual, I pastored many different churches, including planting a couple, like starting a couple from scratch. And that was all, I felt pretty good I felt pretty free until near the end there. I felt I no longer, I didn't feel there was room anymore in the system. And there weren't any other options for me at that time except to resign and leave.
So there seemed to be this kind of closing in on that freedom.
Yeah.
So when you mean by freedom, do you mean by you were allowed to kind of pasture in your own way? You didn't have so many sacraments? Like what kind of freedom were you experiencing beforehand?
Well, freedom to minister as myself and not just fulfilling an official role and sort of being this empty officiant. That's the kind of thing that sounds like death to me. And so, I fulfilled the requirements and responsibilities and expectations and everything of a pastor. Did all the preaching and all the sacraments and, visiting and marrying and burying and baptizing and, all the stuff. I did all that stuff. Um, but the journey I'm talking about is my own spiritual search for what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be true. What is truth? Is everything I've been taught true? Or should I examine everything? And it got to the point where my needing to examine and analyze and really search and really grow started feeling the church I was pastoring at the time, even though it was a great church, uh, there was some discomfort, And then at the same time, though, my blog, Naked Pastor, was becoming more and more famous, and I was sort of building a reputation that not everybody liked, and not everybody appreciated. So the conflict was starting to feel pretty real, and it just got to the point where I knew I couldn't continue on uh, in my personal freedom, and I felt if I kept on as the pastor, it might be detrimental to the church too. So I felt it was the time for me to leave, not only for my own sake, but for the church's sake.
The weight of these expectations, there seemed to be not a space for honesty. And that's a very interesting thing to balance out because sometimes we come to church to look for that certainty, to look for those patterns that we can feel at ease in.
I know,
But
I
then,
know.
yeah, we want the openness, we want the searching. And so that's an interesting space to, how do you balance that? Is it simply, well, the majority want this, therefore, or I'm
Yeah.
on my own journey? Yeah. So that sounds like quite the conundrum to be in a space for sure.
Yeah, so it's like I really felt as a pastor that my job was to help people learn how to take control of their own spiritual lives and become autonomous, like mature, and decide how they were going to be spirit. I felt that was my job, was to enable people, empower people to be the captain of their own ship, the master of their own destiny, kind of a thing. And like you said, a lot of people don't want that. A lot of people, I actually had somebody sit down across from my desk in my pastor's study and say, "We pay you to tell us what to believe." And it was like I realized at that moment that they had the wrong guy. Like that's not a role I'm willing to fulfill. You just sit there like baby birds with your mouths open and I fill it. That's not the kind of minister or pastor I want to be, although there's enough of them out there. And I drew a cartoon around that time where there's a pastor standing in the pulpit and he says, I'm sorry, everybody, but there's been a change. I can no longer help you find, but I can help you seek. And I felt that that was my job as a pastor, is to help people learn how to seek, you know?
Yeah, and I can see the kind of disconnect with the idea or the theology of a church.
Yeah,
Is it a community openness dialogue model, or is it a top-down model where
exactly.
I say from the pulpit, therefore, because I've met people that are on the opposite end. One lady I often ran into in the bus system, right? I heard her talking to many people. My pastor said this, and he only speaks the truth, therefore this is the truth. And I
Yeah,
think she was arguing that women should wear long skirts because her pastor said it.
yeah,
And I was like, huh, maybe there's a little bit more, God did give us really amazing brains. How do we
right.
activate that, but yet keep the image of the church intact?
Yeah. Yeah, like I remember reading an article quite a long time ago. It's kind of a funny memory. I can't find the article now, but it was in something like the Atlantic or something like that, where they were doing sort of a feature on a shepherd in like the mountains of Algeria or somewhere. And this young man shepherd was very good looking and very rugged. And it was kind of like, look at this amazing model kind of looking guy, and he's up in the mountains, wearing leather and fur and out and shepherding sheep. And what I noticed about the pictures, though, was that he was always behind the sheep or among the sheep. He never led the sheep. He was like among them, and they would just wander the mountains, and he would just be with them and behind them and looking out for them, and you know, and I thought that's my idea of what a pastor is, because I really do believe when you leave people, when you empower people to um, take responsibility for their own spiritual health, they'll learn how to do it. It's another analogy I use of like when our kids were very young, we would take them to, I think it was the Ponderosa, where they, they had this long buffet. And when we first took them, we would fill their plates. And then when we got a little older, we would put the healthy things on their plate and we'd let them add some of the other stuff they wanted. After a while, though, you just let them choose what they wanted. And if they wanted to fill their plate with fruit salad and jello, no big deal. It's just one meal. But after a while, they start to know what's good for them, what they want, what's good works for them. And it's the same way spiritually. Maybe at first we need some, here's what's good for you. But after a while, you need to be able to choose what's good for you, what works. That's called adulthood. That's called maturity. And it's the same way spiritually. And so I was working in a system where, like you said, I prefer the among model rather than the hierarchical model. And but what I noticed though, and you're right, is many people prefer the hierarchical model. And I just couldn't operate within that kind of system and expectation.
Yeah, I think the up or down, the my pastor
Yeah,
tells me therefore. I think there's a bit of safety in there because you can turn your brain off,
total safety.
right?
Very, yeah,
And you get to just blame the pastor. You just get to follow the pastor, and
yeah,
I've wondered that too because with my experience of being a high school religious teacher, trying to bring that maturity and equip with tools.
yeah,
And it's hard, it's life-giving, but it challenges people because what if somebody thinks for themselves and disagrees? And what if they think the church philosophy on this doctrine, on this subpoint is incorrect, therefore? And it's like, well, that's fine.
yeah, yeah. So what? Yeah,
Yeah, so what? And that's one of the things I really have enjoyed about your blog, your Instagram work, and which you've turned into a book, is this call to freedom, not just for the sake of freedom, but freedom unto learning and becoming more like Jesus,
right,
right?
right.
We're
Yeah,
given freedom for something, and I think you've oriented that for in a really amazing way. So, for instance, you have your reoccurring character, Sophia.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because she often appears without too much clothes.
Yeah, yeah. And that's symbolic. I mean, the Sophia project was very, very significant, one of the most significant creative periods of my life. And it was after I left the ministry, and it was a very traumatic time for me. And a couple years later, I just found myself drawing this woman who is naked. Now, I must say for your listeners, it's all very discreet. It's all very, it, you don't really see anything, and you don't see her face either. So and it's symbolic of her vulnerability and her exposure. And the whole point of those drawings, there's 59 of them, and they're all in a book now called The Liberation of Sophia, and each one has a meditation, but it's basically a picture journey of my liberation from the oppression of the ministry and the church that it was for me. It's not for everybody, but it was for me. And it was sort of a pictorial uh um uh, documentation of my journey away from all of that into my own personal freedom. And it took me a couple of years to draw them all and to write it all and put it all together. But when I drew the last drawing, the first drawing is her in prison, and then the last drawing is her walking out of a dark cave into the light. And once I'd finished that last drawing called Light, I was done. It was like the inspiration totally evaporated. The project was finished. It was a very strange experience for me, but significant because it is sort of was a graphic um, portrayal of the traumatic journey I went through to get myself free. So yeah, I think a lot of mostly women too. It speaks a lot to them because I know a lot of women who feel trapped in many ways, and so this Sophia journey really resonates with many of them.
When isn't Sophia the kind of the Greek word that means wisdom? Isn't that there's a
Yes.
connection there as well?
Yeah, my
And
own inner wisdom finally was able to come out.
yeah, and through these characters, you have Sophia, which is quite prominent. Another prominent one of your characters is just kind of a square with a rectangle. I mean, a square with a triangle, just labeled church. You just have this
Yeah,
reoccurring church box.
it's a church. It's just a square with a roof and a cross on the top. Yeah, so and it has eyes and a mouth and all that, but that's another one of my characters. Yeah.
And you also tie in, I know you use sheep a lot. I love that you have diversified sheep from just a plain white one to sometimes you use pride colored flags in them as well. And so the symbolism there, as you said, like what does it mean to be a sheep and this kind of role of church? And then you often have the overly smiling preacher. That's another common one, and so it's interesting that you've developed these characters, and I'm wondering, like, when you draw these characters and when they come out, do you see them yourself in them? Are you thinking of certain people? Like,
Uh-huh.
is there always a story behind these art pieces? Who are these characters in a way?
Yeah, I I I wanted to, like, for example, the church one. My I love a really good cartoon, and so for me, the gold standard is a New Yorker cartoon. Like for me, they're the gold standard. One frame, few words as possible, black and white sketch drawing kind of a thing. And that's my gold standard. So I try to draw my cartoons in one frame, very plain and punchy, to the point, as few words as possible. And so I wanted to somehow convey the conflict and the dissociation maybe between Jesus or the teachings of Jesus and the church. So I just came up with an image of the church that it looks like a church building, but it's a character now with eyes and a mouth and feet and little hands. And so for example, I when we feel and many people feel, that Jesus or the church doesn't like the teachings of Jesus like it used to, or whatever. So I draw the cartoon of Jesus in the passenger seat of a car, and the church is driving, and Jesus says, "Remember when you used to let me drive?" So, I think that's a funny cartoon, and it sort of makes you giggle, but I think it might also be true. I also have one where the church and Jesus are on a couch in a counselor's office, and the church says, "We don't have anything in common anymore." And those, how else can you convey that you know, with a lot of words? Like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So if I can condense a whole message down to one little drawing, that for me is a success. So that's what I try to do every day.
And I also wondered with portraying the church in that way too, because you have, these individual characters portraying a church, which kind of seems as an individual character, but the church is a big word. So I had
Yeah.
wondered, do you ever feel or that, the church character might be oversimplifying, or maybe there's more diversity, maybe there needs to be multiple church characters? Like, I'm just wondering
Like,
about a single character over a huge term, the huge
yeah,
word, right?
yeah. And I get that a lot. Like you're painting with a broad brush, or not all churches, or whatever. And yeah, it's true, but I'm I'm aware. I agree. Not all churches, and that doesn't mean every person in that church, agrees and all that kind of thing. But I am speaking generally though. So, for example, recently, in the news, the way things seem to be going, in my opinion, I feel the church has dropped the ball in many ways in performing or fulfilling its prophetic function in the world. Like I think the church has two roles, pastoral and prophetic. And I think the church right now, generally speaking, has dropped the ball in its prophetic role, maybe to protect itself, maybe so it can grow, maybe so it can keep money, maybe so it can protect its leaders, maybe so it can secure its future. I don't know. There are all kinds of reasons. But so I feel it's my job to raise my voice and speak truth to power in my way. And yeah, the church, I've drawn church in positive light as well, many times. So I've drawn the church protecting rainbow sheep, for example, from wolves, or trans sheep, or, or Muslims, or whatever, So but I do lean heavily on the critique side. I'll admit that.
And it's interesting to growing. I grew up Christian as well, and
Right.
you hear the stories and the sermons about how the prophets stood up to the kings, how Jesus stood up to Pharisees, and we seem to love these stories of people standing up to the system. But then I wonder, and your cartoons have made me wonder more too, is like, does the church know that often it is the system that needs to be stood up to?
That's exactly what I'm talking. Yeah, you've articulated well my feeling right now. That the church, if it's going to fulfill its prophetic calling, needs to be complaining a lot. And the people in the church need to challenge the church to fulfill that role. Like I feel that each Christian ought to be resisting the status quo and speaking truth to power. But something happens when we become a part of a system, and we can call it systemic evil or whatever, where the weight of the system just, pulls us down into mediocrity and the status quo and survival. And so I think it takes prophetic people to continually challenge the church to live up to that prophetic task, because it is hard and it is risky and it is life-threatening, you know. As we know, we love the prophets of the Old Testament and the New Testament and Jesus and so on, but we all know what happened to them too. And so even though we would aspire to be prophetic, we're also scared, and rightfully so. And yet I think, this is half of our calling. Like, I feel the church often drops the ball too when it comes to its pastoral task, because we're seeing so much about spiritual abuse and sexual assault and uh, inappropriate stuff going on. And so, yeah, I think if we want the church to continue on, we want it to continue on in a healthy manner. And so I think it needs to continually be called to that by people. I think that's our job.
And I want to step into your book, but just before that, I have to share my favorite cartoon is when Jesus flips the table and he says, "Do it like this."
Yeah, flip it
That
like this. Yeah,
yeah, like this is how you flip a table. So I think that's been my favorite one of that scene where Jesus showed anger, showed contentment. He showed the full range of emotion because the system was getting in the way of God meeting his people.
yeah,
And he,
yeah,
I mean, and he flipped tables. He got a whip somehow in the Bible story. So I think
yeah,
that's one of my favorites of your drawings because it reminds me that yeah, like Jesus spoke to power. He got in the way. He disrupted the ways that people were blocking access to the divine. And
yeah.
sometimes we need to throw some tables.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't just found a whip. He took the time to sit there and weave one, and
Yeah.
and and like, that's premeditated resistance, you know. And yeah, I agree. I see that story more in, even though it can be taken anti-Semitically by some people, that it's Jesus overthrowing the Jewish religion. I more think it was Jesus. I see that as Jesus in the line of the Old Testament prophets that were, like you say, challenging religion to live up to its call to help people, serve people, and connecting with the divine, rather than putting a you know, a cash register in between. And so, yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make. And that, I think that cartoon is so popular these days, along with the one called Overturning, where it's just Jesus flipping tables right now, because it's become sort of a phrase right now. Flip the tables of the patriarchy, flip the tables of the abuse of power, etc. And um, I love seeing that, because it's people living up to their prophetic calling. And Christians, I think, are meant to resist and challenge power and the status quo. I mean, even um, Mary's song, where he casts the mighty from their thrones, and the high places shall be made low, and the low places shall be made high, and etc. Um, I think that we need to be actively involved in that process.
Yeah, to bring about, a relational approach that isn't based on authority, power, keeping the status quo, which can be hard. Like people identify with a certain church community, I believe this, therefore I am, or right? And so challenging our relation to power can be a hard thing because sometimes it benefits us. Being part of a community that maybe is discriminating can benefit males, being part of a community that tells certain groups to, we don't want you can benefit other like, and I think you're right to challenge not just power, but our relation to it in a big
Yes,
way.
yeah, absolutely. That's a hot topic right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, the use of power, authority, these are big things, which is why I really like your book called Without a Vision, My People Prosper, which of course is reverse to the norm of vision statements. So you you come out and challenge vision statements. So what's your beef with vision statements?
Uh, so that's based on um, an Old Testament prophecy. Without a vision, my people prosper. And so a lot of uh, charismatic leaders uh, take that verse to mean we need a vision. I personally feel the correct way to translate that verse is without a word from the Lord, we we perish. That's the actual verse. Without a vision, my people perish. Um, and basically, that's the vision is a vision from God. Like we need to hear the truth in order to prosper, not perish. And so I don't think it should be applied to church community. And that's sort of in the like Bonhoeffer wrote a book on community called Life Together. And in that book, he actually says vision will kill community. And um, people love that book. And so when people love books, let's say, and love ideas, that's one thing. Applying it is another thing. So I thought, you know what? I agree with that. Visionary thinking kills community. And I agree with that. And so I wrote a whole book about it. Actually, it's a whole bunch of blog posts I wrote about that compiled into one book. And the whole point of that is like when you impose on a whole group of people one vision, you're making people squeeze into a box that they may not necessarily fit into. And it might be like me on with my family saying, okay, family, this is the kind of family we're going to be. And therefore, your mom and dad, we have to be this way. And all you kids, you have to be this way in order for us to be this kind of family. I have fantasized about this kind of family. I wanted to be a part of this kind of family that I have in my head. And so we're all going to make it work. What does that do? It actually kills the individuality and the uniqueness of each one of us so that we sacrifice ourselves in order to fulfill this vision. And so I'm not against vision when it comes to business and projects and things like that. And so I actually put it into practice in my congregation. We're scrapping vision statements and goals as a church, as a church community. Our we're going to be a family. We're going to be a community. And the surprising thing was that it it really worked on a deep level. It was a profoundly uh, energetic, passionate, fun, supportive, loving community because people were allowed to be themselves. And just now that didn't mean that there weren't projects happening within the church community that had a vision. So, for example, hey, we want to raise money for a food kitchen. And so we want to reach this goal by the end of the year so that we can feed this many people at Christmas time and all that kind of thing. Like that's a vision, but that's not the whole congregation. It's one board and who had a vision with some people and made that work. And that happened a lot more actually when they were given the freedom. Like somebody would come up to me and say, "Hey, I wanted to start something." And I'm like, "Go for it, you know, do it, and let's see what happens." So within this family where there was no vision statement and you just come and be yourself, it was amazing. Chaos, yes, a lot of chaos, but it was creative chaos. And I think that chaos is why a lot of pastors resist that because pastors normally and leaders normally like order, and the chaos is a lot. I found the chaos really challenging, but it was very creative and it was a marvelous church experience for me.
I like how you word that too. It's not that we don't have moments of vision or goals, but we're not underneath it. We're not oppressed by the statement that we have to attain, because that almost
Right.
seems like it takes the place of God,
Yeah.
right? We've encapsulated God in our vision statement, and let's aim for the vision statement, and God seems to be left on the sideline because you've used his, ability, you've kind of understood him enough to create your own thing. When it's like, well, actually, no, the divine is the goal of it all.
Yeah.
So it's kind
Yeah.
of a reorientation towards the divine that, an acknowledgement that the Holy Spirit within a Christian framework is movement, is understanding, is pushing and pulling, is
Mhm.
creative. And I think that's one of the things I've personally really attached to your work is, do we let people be creative? Do we let the movement of the Holy Spirit? Because my church experience has echoed that, nope. I've made the joke that in my, in certain church scenarios, it's like, well, the Holy Spirit can come if he shuts up and sits in the pew. And
Yeah.
that's one thing I've really appreciated, because the point you make quite a bit, I have it here. You state that Jesus invited people to follow him because his burden was light. So you're convinced that your mandate is to strip people of all burdens and to pare the church down to practically nothing. And you do make that distinction that this sometimes looks like church bashing because we equate unnecessary extras with the church, but in truth, it's breaking it down to that there's movement of the spirit because we're focusing on the right thing.
Yeah. So like we have three children, they're all in their 30s now, and we decided early on that we wanted them to be their most authentic self and take that risk. And being a pastor and a pastor's wife, there's often a lot of pressure on PKs, we called them pastors' kids, to be a certain way. And yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy raising them, but they are three amazing humans now who are very uniquely themselves. And yeah, they're doing their own thing. They've got projects on the go and, very creative people. But I think that's because they were raised in an environment that allowed them to be their greatest self, an expansive kind of a environment to grow up in. And yeah, I think that's what made the church that we did this experiment with very, very creative. For another example would be we decided, like I was a worship leader and I would write worship songs and stuff, and others did too. And we decided, okay, let's make a CD of worship songs. And so we set a date. Let's try to have it by this date so we can submit it to a certain contest. And, we need 12 songs. We know who's going to produce it for us. And so let's get to work. That's a vision. But not everybody in the church cares about a worship CD. Some people don't have a musical bone in the body. And so it's like it was just a handful of people that took on that project and had a vision for it. But we didn't impose that on the whole congregation. And so I think that freedom where you create a space for people to be themselves and to take personal responsibility for their own spiritual health, it creates quite an amazing community that I
Once,
think is healthier for it. Yeah.
yeah, and I was gonna say it seems to be a more active approach to the body of Christ image that we get in scriptures.
Yeah.
Some are called to be the hands, some called to be the feet, and if the foot turned to the hand and said, "I don't need you," and so it seems that we have that imagery of different parts doing different things, but being unified under the head or under Christ.
Yeah.
But then we replace the head with our vision statements, with our top-down approaches, and yeah, people become reliant. Or I always talk about, people get stuck at the veggie tail stage of things and they don't move past that. And I wonder what kind of burdens we place on people. You address that quite a bit as well of, well, we're actually here to remove burdens.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And like I said, though, one of the big challenges was that a lot of people come to church because they want order, and they need order in their own lives, and they need to be told what to do and how to think and what to believe. And but if my kids came up to me and as teenagers and said, "Listen, Dad, life's too hard. I need you to tell me exactly what to do, and I'll do it. And tell me what to think. I don't want to think anymore for myself. Tell me how to feel. Tell me how to behave, and I'll do it exactly as you say." Man, most parents would say, I hope they would say, "No, you got to figure this out, you know?" And so it's the same thing in a church community. It makes for a very vibrant community, in my opinion.
Yeah, the thing I kind of wanted to wrap up with too, because I love your way of phrasing it too. The mind is limited to the categories it knows.
Yeah,
And I think that's one of the key takeaways I've also had is, we often use the phrase think outside the box, which might be overused, but it's relevant because we search for the box, we place ourselves in the box, and we want to protect that.
yeah,
But then we're limited to that, and to expand our minds, which some people take as a threat, I have discovered. It's like, well, if God, the same God that gave us this brain would probably not be the same God that didn't want us to use it. I remember reading that and being like, yeah, like we honor God with who we are by being who we are.
yeah,
And
yeah,
can we create a church environment and community that fosters and honors that? But like you said very well, it seems to create some chaos, but maybe good chaos.
yeah, yeah. Good chaos. I mean, that's where the skill of being I guess a shepherd comes in, is knowing what, it's okay to have disorder, like the sheep aren't all in single file marching in rows across the pasture. They're all just wandering about. And you just look out for the pitfalls and the poison and the predators. Otherwise, they're fine. And yeah, I found that really works. And I know the shepherd analogy and the sheep analogy, a lot of people might be offended by that. But I think there's two kinds of sheep in the Bible. And the one kind is the stupid kind, where they wander away and they're stubborn and they get lost and all this kind of thing. But then there's the ones who are weak and vulnerable and exposed and injured and abused. You know what I mean? So, yeah, sheep can be stupid. Um, and I've seen stupid sheep. Like I have a friend who owns sheep, and they can be stupid, but they're also very weak and vulnerable. So, sometimes the Bible pays attention, kind of focuses on how sheep can be stupid, like we all like sheep have gone astray. But on the other hand, uh, they're spoken about in a tender way where they're carried, because we're weak and vulnerable. So there's both those aspects. I agree. But the shepherd analogy for me is very applicable, where we allow the sheep to find their food, and we're there to help and support and protect when we can.
Well, thank you for your time and for sharing more about your journey. And I love the question you asked in your book, and I think this is the excellent way to summarize our time is it possible for people to enjoy the community without having a vision statement?
Yeah,
And I think that is such a good way of envisioning non-envisionment, if I can say it that way.
yeah, yeah, that's cool. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for listening. Here are some acknowledgments that make this podcast possible. First of all, these conversations are hosted on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Okanagan people. Also, a big thanks to our Spectrum producer, Alexander Carpenter, along with Bryce Hadlock, our editor, Jared Wright, our graphic designer, and Jared Jameson, our audio producer. Conversations like these cannot happen without the continued support of donors like you. So thank you so much for giving to Spectrum and making this possible. Until our next conversation, have a good one, bud.